Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack. I'm so happy to have you back listening to this episode. I realized after recording last week's episode, I I had planned to record a podcast on the family roles we inherit prior to the Thanksgiving holiday, knowing that the holidays bring up a lot. We look forward to them, or I work with clients who don't look forward to them, who dread the holidays. And I work with clients who look forward to them, but find them still incredibly triggering. So I had planned to do the roles we inherit. It ended up releasing the day before Thanksgiving. And then last week's episode was a listener request. When the request was made, I could see how it would play off of the family roles we inherit. So the last two episodes, I would say, have a theme around personal identity, how that develops, and ways that it needs to change so that we can live the life that we need. And I've had this podcast episode down in my podcast episode ideas. I have a list in my phone that if I think of an episode idea, I'll jot it down. I mark off the ones that I've already recorded. And this one had been on podcast episode topics for a little while. And I thought, oh, that's going to fit nice with the other two episodes because it also has a theme around identity. Today's podcast episode, I'm entitling When Recovery Changes Who You Are. And I'll talk about the identity shifts for both partners. It's something I see frequently in the couples that I work with, whether they're healing from sex addiction and betrayal trauma, or from long histories of CPTSD, attachment wounds, or unresolved relational patterns. Recovery changes your identity, not just for the person who caused harm and not just for the person who was hurt, but for both partners. And when identity shifts, the relationship shifts. The roles that we brought into the relationship and played have to shift. And the contract of the relationship shifts. And that can be incredibly disorienting, even when the changes are positive. So today in this episode, I'll talk about how identity evolves, why it feels scary, and how your body often knows what's happening before your mind does. Recovery, real recovery, not performative recovery, requires internal reorganization. It changes your boundaries, your emotional capacity, your tolerance for vulnerability, your willingness to be honest. It has to change beliefs about self, understanding of the attachment issues that shaped you, and the way that you show up in conflict and in closeness. Before people get to the stage of recovering, trauma has shaped identity as well. Betrayal trauma shapes you into someone hyper-aware, self-doubting, and survival-oriented. CPTSD shapes you into someone who has learned to collapse, appease, overfunction, or hide. And attachment wounds shape you into a role: a caretaker, pursuer, withdrawer, peacemaker, hero, or lost child. So, of course, when healing begins, these identities start to unravel. The old self doesn't fit anymore. The emerging self is more functional. It's more adult. It's regulated, more honest, more grounded, and more differentiated. And that is a good thing. But it's also frightening and disorienting. So let's talk about each of these categories that I mentioned: the partner with the sex addiction, the betrayed partner, and someone healing from CPTSD. Let's start with the addicted partner or the partner who has caused harm. For the partner who has historically used avoidance, whether that's through addiction, emotional withdrawal, rage, dissociation, or numbing, the identity shift is big. They move from being avoidant into engagement. They shift from hiding into transparency, from passive into accountable and engaged, and from being the broken one or the problem one to becoming someone driven by values, integrity, and emotional responsibility. It's not just that these behaviors changed, it's also an identity change. Now let's talk briefly about the partner whose nervous system has been impacted, whether that's through betrayal trauma, chronic attachment wounds, their own childhood trauma, or the childhood trauma of their partner, and years of relational instability. Their identity shift is equally profound. They move from hypervigilance into an inner sense of authority, from collapsing into finding their voice, from overfunctioning into shared responsibility, and from the mindset of I have to endure anything into I matter. I also find something that I think is pretty complex that happens for the wounded partner or the betrayed partner. And I would say it happens with most, if not all, of the partners that I have worked with. If I'm working with a betrayed partner, typically one of my colleagues is working with the addicted partner. We have releases signed so that the two therapists are able to communicate in a way that is collaborative on behalf of the relationship and both individuals. It has also been important for me. It's part of why I started my own group practice, that I trust my colleagues, that I know that they do quality work. Maybe it's not the exact same as me. Every therapist has their own individual style. But I have always wanted to work with and hire therapists who strive for excellence in their work and really care about excelling in their profession. And I do think that that is helpful when I'm working with half of the relationship and my colleague is working with the other half. My client might come in, whether this is a betrayed partner or the addicted partner, they might come in and say, my partner told me this, and they said that this therapist said this, and that makes me really uncomfortable. I don't know if I can trust them. And often I'm in a position to say, I know this person. I know your partner's therapist. And that doesn't sound like something that they say, or that's not how they approach that issue. Sometimes I've been in those situations and I might say, but also I'm wondering if this is happening, right? I'm not saying their partner is lying, but I will say, I think often therapy is a very vulnerable process. And sometimes we hear what we want to hear, not necessarily what the person is, not necessarily what the therapist is actually saying. And I'll say that's happened to me too. So let me get some clarity or let me talk to them about that, let them know. And if we're doing some joint sessions, I'll say we can talk about it if we need to in our joint session. But I find it very helpful if I'm working with a partner or if I'm working with the addicted partner to trust the therapist who I like to be my colleague who is working with the other half. I find often with betrayed partners, there comes a point in the process where their addicted spouse is making progress. They might have sobriety. They're understanding the addiction at a deeper level. And it's not uncommon for this conversation to arise in a session with the partner where they will ask me, Is there a list of signs that I can look for if they start to backslide? Or I need to learn what to look for and to watch for. This is part of hypervigilance. And I understand where it's coming from. In essence, they're asking me for a checklist so they can rebuild trust and safety with their partner. And that makes perfect sense. When you've lived through relational earthquakes, you become a professional tremor detector. Also, part of betrayal trauma is the blind side. For most partners I have worked with, and there's always some unique things to each situation, but almost always there was a feeling of being blindsided. And that part of the trauma, they want to avoid happening ever again. So while I can understand where their need is coming from, and even the sense of urgency around it, I tell them this isn't a one size fits all. There's no checklist. And even if there was one, you could still miss things. Not because you're careless, but because trauma creates blind spots. Betrayal blindness is real, and attachment wounds are real. Survival mode is also real. And for partners, their recovery can't be accomplished with a checklist. The work is not about catching the signs. The work is actually about reconnecting or learning how to connect to your body. Because your body already knows what your mind hasn't caught up to yet. But this is often scary because they were blindsided and they don't want that to happen again. There's actually a neuroscience term for this concept of our body already being aware our body already knowing what our mind hasn't caught up to yet. And that's neuroception. Neuroception is the nervous system's automatic, non-conscious scanning for cues of safety, danger, and life threat. It happens before thinking, before reasoning, before any logic. It's often why you'll hear comments like, something just fell off. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. Or my stomach dropped. Or my chest got tight. Your neuroception picks up on micro cues, tone shifts, emotional inconsistency, avoidance, and congruence long before our conscious brain has any evidence or has even put it all together. Let me give you an example, an anonymized example from my own life to illustrate this. A while ago, someone who worked for me gave her 2 weeks' notice. Everything on the outside looked fine. She was professional. The transition was smooth. There was nothing obvious to point to. But at the end of week 1, my gut said, something's off. I even said to Rachel, who at the time was my clinical director, I don't have anything I can point to, but my gut is saying she's bullshitting you. I had no evidence. She was following through on what she said. She was showing up. She was friendly and respectful to me, maybe a little more friendly, and she talked to me more than she had in the 3 years she worked for me. But there was nothing I could articulate as a red flag. So while I was aware of what my gut was saying, and I spoke it to Rachel, I didn't do anything with it. There wasn't anything to do, but the gut feeling didn't settle. It didn't soften and dissipate. My gut held that feeling of it's not what this at the end of week 1, I tried to follow up with her from the first week about transitioning clients. She had told me that she had told me when she gave her 2 weeks notice that she would be transferring clients to other therapists within the practice. And in week 1, we were talking about that. But in week 2, from my perspective as the owner and experienced therapist, week 2 is when we start to make the handoff, from one therapist to the next so that it is as smooth and seamless as it can be for the client. However, in week 2, when I brought up the conversation about transitioning clients, she either dismissed it or simply avoided the conversation. I still didn't have proof of anything, but my gut was still saying something's off. And it wasn't until about 2 months later that the truth revealed itself. And I learned I was right. Had I known at the time, I don't know that I would have done anything differently. Employees have a right to leave the practice and do something else. In this particular situation, I wasn't in danger, but my gut was saying, don't trust this. And I think what mattered is that my gut clarity never changed. My neuroception stayed consistent. The evidence just hadn't arrived yet. And when the truth finally came out 2 months later, when I realized my gut had been right the whole time, it didn't actually just validate that one moment. It brought clarity to the entire pattern that I had been struggling with as a business owner for almost 3 years. When I was talking to other people in my personal life, I would say the hardest part of being a business owner the last 3 years has been employees. Now, if I'm being honest, there's issues that arise with employees as a business owner, but these ones just felt different and they felt bigger. Some employees would quit, others I let go. And during those years, my clinical director, Rachel, would say to me, Jackie, you need to rebuild. You need to rebuild the team. You can do this. You need to lead us. You need to create a vision that we can all get behind and contribute to. And she would remind me of the times when we had highly effective teams working together and the energy that created, the creativity that came out of us working together as a team. And I would. Every time something went wrong, I would rally. I'd re-envision the work. I would re-envision the culture. I would recommit, or sometimes as a team, we would talk about what our mission was. And I tried to lead from a grounded place. And yes, I was exhausted, absolutely exhausted. But I also knew that I didn't want new employees that I hired to walk into a bad experience. I knew it wasn't fair for them to inherit the fallout. So I kept showing up with as much clarity and steadiness as I could, even when I was running on fumes. And it seemed like no matter how much energy I poured into rebuilding, recreating, I could never get traction. Something always felt like it was slipping through my fingers. So when I discovered this particular employee had been lying to me, I also discovered something else at the same time. Something that made those 3 years make sense for the very first time. I had always been looking at each of those years as its own particular set of issues. But the issues I had been dealing with all 3 years weren't actually separate issues. They were connected. Yeah, different employees, different situations, and different conflicts. Some of these employees hadn't even met each other. But what I saw was there was this one common thread, one person who did know the previous employees, one person who befriended new hires. I would even say to them, thank you so much for welcoming the new hires and taking them on and making them feel a part of the team. But what I realized was there was also one person who quietly, subtly, and almost invisibly were souring certain new hires. Yes, against me, but not just against me. It was subtle enough that I couldn't see the pattern. I didn't see that they were all connected. And I had no idea. I kept thinking each problem that I had had to deal with that particular year was isolated. I kept trying to fix each situation that would arise as its own set of issues. And I kept asking myself, what am I doing wrong? What am I not seeing? I even would say to my spouse, maybe I just don't know how to run a business. Maybe I've just been lucky for 11 years. And sure, there had been issues in the previous 11 years, but not long drawn out the way this was. This was different. But once the truth surfaced, once the whole picture came into light, everything came into focus. It was like realizing I had been walking around a dark room for 3 years trying to find the light switch. And the light switch was on the outside of the room. When the lights finally came on, what I saw was undeniable. And here's how this story ties directly into this episode. My gut had been signaling the truth the entire time. My neuroception was picking up patterns. I couldn't articulate them, couldn't really put my finger on them. My body knew long before any evidence existed. But I didn't trust it because I couldn't prove it. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. I'm not going to go all in if I don't have any evidence. But I think it's a very common place that so many partners in recovery find themselves. Your intuition is accurate. Your nervous system is reading something real. But your mind doesn't have the facts yet. And when the truth eventually reveals itself, it doesn't just clarify that particular moment. It might clarify the last few months, the last few years, sometimes your whole relational history. And it shows you that your intuition wasn't chaotic. You weren't crazy. You were correct. And that needs to be a turning point in how you trust your body going forward. But often, our gut clarity gets confused by anxiety, by fear, by anger. Sometimes our gut is really clear, but because we don't have evidence yet, we try to force the evidence. And this is where partners can get into trouble, or anybody could get into trouble. Your gut says something is off, but the mind says, I need proof. I want certainty. I want it, and I want that proof and certainty right now. So partners start to interrogate. They spiral. They check devices. They push for confession. They ruminate. They overreact. And then they feel crazy because the escalation has distorted the clarity. Your body isn't wrong. It's your urgency and this need to try to control it or force it that's confusing you. If I'm in this situation working with a partner, I will say, let's slow down, reconnect to that gut feeling, but you have to wait. And this is what I've come to say to them. I believe that the universe doesn't like secrets. It conspires to reveal the truth, to lead you to it, but you can't force the timing. Over time and with a lot of work, I learned that my gut can actually ground me. I trust it even when I wish the evidence would show up faster. And almost every time, the universe reveals the truth in a better, cleaner way than I ever could have forced. And sometimes, what I'll say to partners, sometimes what you're feeling isn't about them relapsing, it's about them changing. And that's a crucial difference. You might be picking up, your neuroception might be picking up that something is off, but it might not have anything to do with the past, relapse, dishonesty, or danger. Sometimes what feels off is actually your partner changing. And positive change, believe it or not, can feel threatening. Why? Because your nervous system learned that sudden shifts often meant danger. And a trauma trained body doesn't just react to danger, it reacts to difference. So when your partner becomes more honest or more regulated, more open and more accountable, your body might still brace and think, I don't trust this. Not because it's unsafe, but because it's unfamiliar. In healing, you begin learning the difference between threat and unfamiliar safety, between relapse and growth, between the past being repeated and the future being built. This is a huge identity shift for the wounded partner. To feel something and not assume danger. To trust that what they need to know will be revealed. And to pause long enough for clarity to emerge. And also to learn that sometimes the thing that feels off is actually something becoming right. So we have to develop a new skill, which is noticing and waiting. It's where the real recovery work happens. Not in checking, not in interrogating, not in spiraling or overanalyzing. Of course, that might still happen. It's hard not to go there, but that's not what will work. So we may have to catch ourselves doing that and calm and still ourselves. Because what works is noticing, regulating, waiting, and allowing for the truth to unfold. Intuition becomes clearer when you slow down. Anxiety gets louder, though, when you speed up. Your neuroception can guide you, but not when you're dysregulated. So when the emotional storm settles and the true signal remains, it might be a warning. Sometimes it's a memory. And sometimes it's an invitation to learn to trust safety again. Let me share another example. And I think this is one that illustrates how complicated this identity shift can be for the addicted partner and the betrayed partner, even years into recovery. So in this case, I worked with the betrayed partner, and my colleague worked with her husband, who was the addict in recovery. He had been sober for 3 years. So what that means is over 3 years of doing the work, being accountable, showing up honestly, engaging in recovery, and building a different kind of life. But he was frustrated. He would complain to my colleague, his therapist, that his reactions had changed, but hers hadn't. That she still responds the same way she did at the beginning of the process. And that she's really not in therapy unless there's a crisis. She wasn't attending weekly therapy like he was. If things got intense enough, she would schedule a session. But that's not how we get traction. And I think it's key to say that in this situation, he was not blaming her. But he did want to see change for her as well. and he was longing for connection. He wanted their relationship to grow now that he had grown. And so one day he told her, gently but firmly, I need you to engage in weekly sessions as well. I'm doing the work, but I need you to do the work too. So she reached out to me, scheduled the session. And in the session, she told me what he had told her. And she even said, I know he's right. Weekly sessions would give her traction that crisis driven sessions never could. And to her credit, she got to work. We started meeting every week. Eventually, we were meeting regularly, her individual sessions, his individual sessions, and one joint session with all four of us together, both partners and both therapists. And here's what came out. I was picking up in her individual sessions the anxiety she had that was informed by the past, and that her nervous system had not updated to the present, where the two of them were now. Even though he had 3 years of sobriety, he wasn't slipping, he wasn't acting out. Her body still reacted as if the danger was happening in real time. And this isn't just her. I find this with partners. And when I'm talking to other CSATs, they'll report similar things. When this couple was out in public and she noticed an attractive woman, her nervous system tensed, her stomach dropped. She watched him. She waited for the confession. She waited for the other shoe to drop. And she waited for the reassurance that it wasn't safe to trust him. That's betrayal trauma. It's neuroception. It's the body remembering what the mind wishes it could forget. So, of course, she was certain he just was hiding again. He wasn't being honest. She didn't have any evidence, but she did have the sensations. Her gut was telling her he's back at it. And sensation can feel like certainty. But we had been doing enough joint sessions that I didn't think he was lying. And I talked to my colleague, and he didn't think he was lying. You do get a feel for the level of work that they can do. And that's not happening if they're still in active addiction. I had been in the room with both of them enough to feel the difference. And so, as our next joint session was coming up, and I knew what we talked about in our individual session, I knew some of what he was talking about and working on in his individual sessions because he would bring it up in our joint sessions, and his therapist and I would collaborate together. Both of them were stuck because they were in this place where they were 3 years ago. And my colleague and I were both trying to help them get unstuck. And so as our next session started, and he's talking, she's talking about what we're going to be focusing on, I had some clarity of, oh, I know where this session needs to go. I knew this session could be critical to getting unstuck. Now, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes I think it could, but the timing didn't happen that time. But I have a sense of, oh, this is where we need to go for them to get unstuck. I knew that she needed clarity. I knew what he needed to say out loud to help her system start to move. But I didn't work with him. I also knew that they needed to understand what relapse energy felt like in the past wasn't what was happening now. What was happening now was actually growth energy. And I knew this at the beginning of the session, and I knew this early in that joint session, but I couldn't tell him what I needed him to say, couldn't tell my colleague what I wanted him to help him say. And I couldn't tell my client, "Hey, can you ask this question? This is a question that your gut needs to ask." So, I asked him. She was sharing what was coming up for her. He was expressing frustration that she was still stuck in the past. And we talked about this dynamic that both of them were experiencing. And then I asked him gently, but trying to get him to read my mind as to what I would needed him to say and to give voice to the question that I knew her gut needed an answer to. And so I said, "Why aren't those old triggers leading to relapse anymore? Those are the triggers that used to get you right back into active addiction. And you're saying that's not happening anymore. And you're frustrated that she doesn't believe you. But maybe you could tell us what's different now." He wasn't fully prepared for the question. As I said, his therapist didn't know it was coming, but I trusted him. I also trusted my colleague that he would support him through it. And eventually they'd get to where I wanted them to get to. And so he paused and he answered, he thought some more. And eventually he got to this place where he said, "Because I didn't like my life as an addict. Living as an addict was exhausting. It wasn't fun. It wasn't who I wanted to be. But I didn't know how to change any of that. Now I know I don't have to live that way anymore. And living the way that I'm living actually feels good." And she sat there. She didn't know what to say. It was like her whole nervous system didn't know where to file that answer because it wasn't the confession she was tensing for. It wasn't a justification. And I think all of us in the room could feel that it wasn't a lie, wasn't a threat. I think on some level, she recognized the truth, even though it was unfamiliar and she didn't know what to do with it. Sometimes when partners feel that gut feeling, what they're sensing isn't about relapse, it's about change. And their nervous system doesn't have a category for unfamiliar safety yet. Also, that was new for him. And I see this in the work I do with addicts. They get to a place in their work, and yeah, often they know when they come in and start therapy that they have to take the lead. They did the damage, they caused the harm. So they have to lead. And often I would say they're used to being the bad one, or they're used to being the problematic one. And so they work, they dig in, we start, they they're committed to coming to therapy and they make improvements and they get better and they start understanding why the addiction, of course, the addiction, and then what comes next. It's often not mapped out for them. They don't have a clear vision, but there's hope that they can live differently. And sometimes for the partner, where they're not necessarily coming into therapy because of problems they have. Partners often show up to therapy because of something that was done to them. And that's valid. That is legitimate. I'm not going to take that away from a partner. But at some point, staying in this place of I was harmed and I'm here only because I was harmed doesn't move them, doesn't get them into their own work. And it's a very different place when addicts start talking about, if my partner doesn't start coming to therapy weekly, or if my partner isn't willing to do this, that may be a deal breaker for me. And they're not used to the deal breaker being their partner's issue. They are used to, they are the deal breaker. And that's a very uncomfortable place for them. They're right. If the relationship is going to heal, both people have to be in recovery from what was happening. Both people have to be doing the work and they have to be in recovery from what was. And that's often scary for them to say to their partner, "Hey, this isn't going to work if you're not willing to do this." They say it in a way that is inviting because they want them to do this. They are wanting the relationship to work. This pattern isn't limited only to betrayal partners, though. I see something very similar and often just as complex with clients who are recovering from CPTSD and longstanding attachment wounds. For many CPTSD clients, the deepest pattern, well, I would say there's two. Well, the first deepest pattern is a deep seated fear of abandonment. And the second deepest pattern is not trusting their partner, not trusting others, not trusting love, not trusting safety, not trusting good things, and not trusting themselves. Sometimes they know they're competent, but competent isn't trusting. Being capable is not the same thing as being able to trust. Because somewhere in their early life, trusting became a bad idea. It was unsafe. It was dangerous, predictably disappointing. And think about it. If you listen to the other two podcast episodes I've done before this one, and you think of the roles that we inherit in our family of origin, those aren't inherited because of trust. In fact, just the opposite. We become the hero, the caretaker, the golden child, the scapegoat, the invisible child, because we can't trust. We don't trust. So even as an adult, when their partner is loving and supportive and consistent, they can't let it in. Their neuroception reads love itself as a threat. I've had clients who say, when my partner tells me they love me, I feel like they're manipulating me. That is a really hard situation to be in. For both the person who is being told that they're loved and they read that as manipulation, and for the partner who truly thinks they're giving and offering love and they're being told that's manipulative. It's a very painful dynamic that gets created in relationships. They're both longing for love, but the one cannot tolerate it when it comes, and the other one wonders if they even know what love is. So the one who is wounded, who needs to recover from CPTSD, they blame their partner for not making me feel loved or not making me feel enough, for not filling the void of this black hole in my soul. Even though the void cannot be filled from the outside. I've worked with so many couples where this unresolved lack of trust eventually turns into rage. Rage at the partner who is loving them, but who can never break through their defenses that were created decades ago. And they can't break through not because they're doing something wrong, but because the recipient isn't open to it. They don't trust it, so they cannot receive it. And that is a heartbreaking paradox. Because when you've had to survive a childhood where you had to adapt, to stay quiet, to be small, to be perfect, to be vigilant, to be useful, to be emotionally responsible for others, you don't develop trust. You don't develop the internal sense of being safe with others. And you don't learn how to feel loved. You might learn how to earn connection or to manage it or perform it. You might try to control it. But none of that is the same as receiving it. And as we start to uncover this and excavate it, There's often a time we uncover a hidden, unspoken bargain that they made long before they were ever conscious of making it. It's still an unknown agreement. The agreement they made is if I can't be loved, then I will be needed. Be needed is predictable. Be needed might feel safe. It is controllable and it may feel familiar. But the truth is, being needed can never be an adequate substitute for being loved. It's a survival strategy, not an identity. And this is why recovery for CPTSD clients and betrayed partners alike requires going back to the origin story, not simply to revisit pain, but to understand the adaptations that became the blueprint for their entire relational life. Because until we understand that, we will only keep reenacting it. And what I find is that as the relational identity starts to form, the individual identity is more solid and it's starting to take shape. We start to develop relational identity. We start to develop a new relationship identity. Instead of one person managing the emotional load, the other person hiding, one person over functioning, the other person avoiding. And instead of this trauma driven dynamic, we start to see two functional adults who can both share responsibility. There's emotional transparency. Often, this is where repair starts to work. There's boundaries that protect the connection in the relationship. We're simply not going to say things that we used to say that damage the relationship. There's some differentiation that starts to lead to connecting. And there's an adult partnership instead of just mutual survival systems. This is a relationship that evolves with the people in it. This is something that can sustain. This relationship can sustain each individual. And the couple's identity changes in a way that can feel unfamiliar at first. But I find they often feel that it's deeply healthy. As I wrap up this episode, I want to speak a moment to betrayed partners, CPTSD survivors, and addicted partners. Anyone who is doing the hard, holy work of reshaping their relational identity. Because you're not just healing behaviors, you're healing beliefs, you're healing survival strategies, and you're healing the untold stories your body has carried for years. There's 3 quotes that I have come across over the past, I don't even know how long it's been. I used to have them written in notebooks before smartphones. Now I have an ongoing list in my notes section on therapy quotes. Sometimes I just write them down and put them in there. Other times I'll review them and look at them and I think, oh, wow, these 3 really go together well. And I'll cut and paste and put them together. So I want to weave in 3 of these quotes that I've put together on my notes page about developing identity. So the first quote is by Maya Angelou, and I think she captures what we're trying to do in reshaping relational identity perfectly. She says, quote, "There is no greater agony than burying an untold story inside of you," end quote. And this is what recovery brings to the surface. The stories that you were never allowed to tell, maybe that you were never allowed to know, the truths that you had to train yourself to dismiss, and the pain that your nervous system has been holding on your behalf. The story of why your body tenses, the story of why trust feels impossible, the story of why love feels dangerous and unattainable, and the story of why you took on the roles that you took on in your family of origin. Sometimes I'll use an analogy. When my kids were younger, they discovered the Scooby-Doo show. and they loved to watch episodes of Scooby-Doo. And I liked to watch Scooby-Doo when I was a kid too. As a mom, I'm rehearing. Sometimes I'm not sitting down watching the show with them. I'm doing things around the house, but I can hear the show. Some of them I even remembered from when I was a kid. And as an adult, maybe even as a kid, but you start to notice that every show follows a predictable pattern. And again, I'm a therapist and I start to see, oh, that's kind of like healing. Healing follows a predictable pattern. So sometimes when I'm talking about this untold story that our body is holding on to, I'll put it in the pattern of a Scooby-Doo show. The gang gets a call. There's something being haunted. They have to go investigate. They get into the mystery van. They go to where they're going to. And initially, it's scary. They're being haunted. They're experiencing the hauntings that they were called in to investigate and solve. And the show gets intense. It's scary. And the show is scary. And I think appropriately so, at least for my kids. My kids, they were scared, but they also loved the feeling and the predictability that it probably wasn't as scary as it felt when they were watching the show. And then at the end, they figured it out. They know who the culprit is. And there's the unmasking. And it's old Mr. Jones or whatever the story ends with. And I find something similar in the work that I do with clients. This untold story is haunting them. They see blurbs of it that escape the body and come out. And it scares them. And they think, oh no, I got to get that back down. I got to suppress that. Got to get that back in the compartment that I put it in a long time ago. And eventually it doesn't work anymore to try to keep things compartmentalized, to keep it unknown. And they come into therapy. There's problems going on. And eventually, similar to the Scooby-Doo gang, have to start following the clues. And when we come to the unveiling, it's recognizable. We pull the mask off, we pull the sheet off of the ghost, and what's underneath is recognizable. Oh, it's old Mr. Jones. Oh, it's this and this and this experience. Oh, that starts to make sense. And what has been haunting them actually starts to be healing. And in recovery, the story finally comes out, often slowly, sometimes explosively. But there's a moment of clarity that starts to shift everything. And as we've talked about in this episode, your gut often knows before the evidence appears. Your neuroception remembers patterns before your mind can name them. Your body will tell the truth long before your partner does. And unfamiliar safety can feel exactly like old danger until we see that it's not. When your partner grows, when they stabilize, when they develop a new identity, your nervous system isn't wrong for not knowing how to receive it. You're not crazy. You're not failing. But you do have to learn to live in a world where the danger is no longer the first thing you go to, because the danger is no longer present. And you let your body and your nervous system catch up. And for those healing from CPTSD, which would also say, in my work with sex addiction, they all have CPTSD. So for those who are healing from sex addiction and CPTSD, you're learning to trust love, real love, for the first time. Because when you've been shaped by a childhood that required you to adapt in order to have attachment, you're never going to develop trust. Instead, you develop strategies. And for some of you, the unspoken bargain that you made decades ago was, if I cannot be loved, I will be needed, invisible, angry. But being needed is never a substitute for being loved. Recovery is the process of learning to be loved not used, not managed, not relied on, not depended on, not invisible, but loved. And that requires becoming someone new. There's a quote by Gary Liu that I also have saved on my notes page that says, "The world is yours. Shape it or someone else will." Betrayal trauma, family of origin trauma, religious trauma, and early attachment wounds shape your world for you until you begin shaping it yourself. Recovery is the moment you reclaim your life. You take the pen back. It's the moment you stop writing the story that came from fear or adaptation, survival, or trauma, and you start writing the story that comes from truth, that comes from intuition, that comes from inner authority, that empowers you. And for some of you, what's waiting for you on the other side of this process is a relationship you've never seen before, a version of yourself that you've never met before, and a level of intimacy that you didn't know was possible. But to get there, you have to be willing to release the identities, the roles, and the protections that were built for a different era of your life. And I'll leave you with this quote from Joseph Campbell: "We must be willing to get rid of the life we have planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." You're not just grieving what happened, you're grieving who you had to be, and you're stepping into who you're becoming. And that's the life that's waiting for you, the love that's waiting for you, the connection, the safety, the clarity that's waiting for you, that is built on truth, intuition, grounded trust, an identity that actually fits you. This is the work. It's the journey. It's also the transformation. You're not doing it wrong. You're healing. And you're closer than you think. Your body is designed for healing. Your intuition knows. Your nervous system knows. And it works on your behalf. And the truth always finds a way to the surface. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.